world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today we're thrilled to be joined by four entrepreneurs working with data to change the world. Julian Ranger is the chairman of Digi.me, a platform that allows users to take back ownership of their data, currently spread around the web, and use it to their own benefit. Aneesh Verna is the founder and CEO of Aire, a new breed of credit bureau improving access to credit. Bradley and Hannah Leach are from Adapt, an advisory firm helping companies build strategies and governance around data. What more topical subject right now than data? With GDPR still brand new and the Facebook Cambridge Analytica saga still fresh in mind. In this episode, we talk about how people and companies should think about data, what's still missing from the data equation, the ethics of data and its capture, retention, and processing, the tension between commercial and privacy concerns, and much more. Connect with us on Twitter, at Rebank Podcast, on Facebook, LinkedIn, or on our website at www.bankingthefuture.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast platform of choice and leave us a review. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please welcome Aneesh Verna, Bradley, Hannah Leach, and Julian Ranger. Aneesh, Charles, Hannah, and Julian, welcome to Rebank.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's good to connect with you guys, and I think it's an interesting topic of conversation tonight. So data ethics. And I think you all bring interesting perspectives to this, and maybe by way of introduction, you can just kind of give your name and a very quick description of the work you do. Aneesh, you want to start?
Yeah, so my name's Aneesh, one of the founders of a company called Aire, and all our focus is on the space of credit, not as a distributor of credit, but helping consumers position themselves and explain their credit situation to lenders and banks in the context of helping them get better outcomes from credit.
Yeah, I'm Charles. I'm here with Hannah. We're both here from Adapt. Adapt helps companies rethink their relationship with data to build trust, to create value, and drive social change.
So hi, I'm Julian. I'm the founder of Digi.me. We're a company that allows individuals to get back all their data. So you get a full copy of all of your social, financial, health, wearables data yourself. You own it yourself, so you can do more with it. But then companies are going to come and ask you for it because it's better data. They can do more.
So my hunches were with a mildly biased crowd here. But Julian, in your view, where are we with data now, and what is the potential going forward?
So now we're actually in a situation where, contrary to most people's perception, we're using very little personal data. Right? We're just a bit of social, bit of web browsing, bit of searching, occasional bits of location. But we're doing an immense amount of economics with it. Not fully consented, so that's why all these privacy issues. But imagine what you could do if you could actually use all of your data, all your health, wearables, genomics, all of your finance, everything you see, watch, do. Now that sounds frightening, but not if you can consent to it, if you decide you like the value proposition. So we're actually at the early stages of use of data. And it's analogous to the early stages of the car, and then we developed safety devices and we went faster and did more things. So we're just at the point where we're not going to do less, we're going to do masses more, but with you in control.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Charles, everyone's, or at least the kind of average consumer, and perhaps even some of us on a personal level, when we're outside the office, kind of hear data availability, data processing, sharing genomics, wearables. Oh my God, they're going to know everything about me. I'm going to start getting targeted ads for diapers before, I even know my wife is pregnant and all the rest. My life is going to be taken from me. corporations are going to shape my future. Is that a concern that people should have? And is there a role for a bit of structure around who's processing what? Is GDPR beneficial in the context of all of this? What are your thoughts from where you sit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the conversation has always been sort of this dichotomy of, on one side, we shouldn't be using data because that's a challenge to our privacy and the sort of enshrined rights that we have as individuals, which has been a challenging sort of phenomenon given the sort of the actual sort of drive of economic value that has come from that. And then on the other side, we have businesses that have just built fast and done the things they have done and built, with sharp elbows, some of the biggest and most valuable companies in the world. We see that there's a tightrope to be walked in the middle of this, which is a more responsible approach to both of those. We can ensure the privacy and the other rights of users, but also the security and protection of these users, whilst also maximizing the social and economic value of that data. And some of the issues that we're talking about and we see from this particularly wealthy neighborhood that we're in at the moment are, am I going to get served that advert, or am I going to be, my rights being infringed by that new marketing email that 60 companies have emailed us in the last month to say we'd love to still send you this irrelevant information. But there is a genuine risk to a lot of individuals, vulnerable communities and vulnerable individuals around the world, where with this data being in the wrong hands and being used by the wrong people, there's a genuine risk to security and privacy, much more beyond the annoyance of this data. So making sure that we walk that tightrope with the greatest sort of responsibility and sort of an ethical founding is super important for the future, because we need to understand what a bit of structure would look like to actually drive data as a fuel for the future of these services, which actually meets the goals rather than undermines the actual goals that we try to achieve.
Mm-hmm. So does it, I mean, I guess if one oversimplifies, it kind of feels like we've moved in this direction where the Facebooks, the Googles of the world are kind of capturing as much data as they can and looking to maximize that use for commercial gain. Then in response to that and some other new developments, the EU through GDPR and others have proposed some frameworks around data ownership and management. Is it as simple as a tension between corporate commercial interests versus the interests of individuals in terms of who owns and processes data? Or is there potentially a middle road that benefits both individuals in terms of sharing data, enhancing their experiences, and corporations who are able to continue to commercialize based off of user data?
Yeah, absolutely. And at Adapt, we think of this as a three-way value proposition of collecting, using, storing, and sharing data. The first is there has to be a value for the user. You have to be able to drive a better product, a better service, you have to give them better value. And that might, in the future, be some actually economic value that has been created and shared back with them. But at the moment, it's more traditionally a better product or service. There has to be value to the business. So the second of the three value propositions. There's value being created, economic value, growth potential, etc. to them. But also there has to be value to society. So how can we use, collect and share that data in a way that actually drives society at large? And that is the basis of which you can have a much more nuanced and trusted relationship, much more adult partnership with your users, where you're actually demonstrating there is value to you, there's value to the business, but also the value to the society that that person wants to actually be a part of in the future.
Yeah. Well, Aneesh, it feels like Aire is kind of a nice example of exactly what Charles is explaining in terms of value to user, value to business, and value to society if it opens up access to credit.
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about win-win outcomes at the company. That's one of our values, and at the heart of it, it's built to help consumers, right? That is very much the mission of this company. But lending, the space that we occupy is credit, and credit has two big participants. There's the lender, which is large financial institutions typically, and if you're just building something that allows consumers to get a lot of money, and the lenders are not going to make benefit, they're not going to participate. So the process we've gone through and the journey that we've been on is effectively how do you get the consumer to participate in this process, which in many ways, if you think about it, data was always being used to make credit decisions, but the consumer was never part of it. It's kind of strange, right? Somebody else was writing your CV and applying for a job for you, but you had just very little control over it. So Aire allows you to bring in more data as a consumer. Again, you're consented to it. And that allows us, Aire, to step in and provide better outcomes with the lender. So it's a win-win on both sides. But, I think one of the things, Charles and the team Adapt talking about that, I think it's perfect. There are going to be situations where you get this nice win-win outcome. And, I'd love to put Aire in that category, as you said. But I also believe the way the capitalist market will evolve, you will also have the flip side where there will be just constantly companies trying to figure out how to slice and reslice and figure out how to keep that ad tracking on or create another method to exploit that data, if you may. And even if it exists in the concept of GDPR and is consented. So this is just the reality of how we evolve, right? Technology is there. We will always repurpose it. And I think it comes down to the responsibility of each company and sort of each group of companies to figure out how they want to interact with that. And I think you will have n number of outcomes, sadly, that will happen. I'm still not a believer that GDPR and all these things will create the perfect outcome, and that's it. You'll never get a spam email tomorrow, and your credit score will be perfect.
Well, it's interesting. Like GDPR, in my very limited experience with it to date, it's a couple weeks on from go live. It already feels like it's putting small guys at a disadvantage. It feels like large companies, for whom data is a key part of the business model, are staffed with lawyers, with compliance officers, lobbyists, willing to defend their position if it comes to it, and send out those sorts of emails that said, "Here's our updated privacy policy." And you got tons of emails from smaller organizations saying, go in and update your preferences if you want to continue hearing from us. So you basically had like an 80 to 90% drop off in subscriber bases for small companies and no change for large companies. And I don't know about you guys, but if I go onto websites now, some of them pop up and they have tick boxes right there when you can say, I suppose the marketing checkbox is already unchecked. The necessary cookies checkbox is checked. And you have control over what you check and uncheck. And others, it mentions something about how you can change your preferences. You have to click through to another page. You have to drop down through some labyrinthine menus. You have to find the part that you need to opt out of. And it just doesn't feel like it's doing exactly what it's intended to. So, Aneesh, I think I totally agree that we're probably not there yet. It won't be the magic bullet. Julian, I'd be interested from where you sit. I mean, that question of large capturers and processors of data, and traditionally social media companies have been some of the kind of the biggest, and that's squarely the sort of stuff that you guys deal with. I mean, what's your view in terms of data responsibility at those large organizations, and what individuals should be doing to ensure that their data is working for them?
So I want to start by saying I think we need to be much more positive. Right? GDPR will create positivity because you're looking at what you've seen, which is natural, right? It's about, can I still have your data that I had before that you didn't really consent and I need to rewash it? Right? Well, rewashing never works very well, right? But GDPR has lots of other things to it. And the two most important are data portability, your right to have a full copy of all of your data, and then full consent going forwards. So when we look today, there's a whole industry to track us. Now, why has that grown up? Not because people are naturally nasty or want to be unethical, but because it was the only way they could build the businesses. There was no system other than that. And just like when we started cars, they got faster, they didn't have any safety devices and you died and things like that until we had seatbelts, crumple zones, crash bars. We didn't have those for the internet. Now we're getting them, all right? And when we get them, things change. So at the moment, all of this activity is going around you. You're not part of it. So you don't know what's happening. It makes you feel, right? But actually also the data's rubbish, right? Now that's perhaps a little bit harsh. It's just not very good. It's thin. It's 30 to 50% wrong, right? And some data brokers will admit it's even worse than that. And it's very expensive. But now imagine a world enabled by GDPR and general life where you own all your data. You have a full copy yourself, right? So you've got all your health data, all your finance, all your social, everything. You build this absolutely mammoth library of yours that has to be fully secure. You own it. But now companies can come to you, so the relationship becomes one-on-one for a singular purpose, not your data floating around in the ether with lots of people taking it. You don't know what's going on. Now, when it's a singular purpose, more businesses are going to come to you because it's much, much better data. I have ground truth about me, right? And if you've got the value proposition that you were talking about, that service, convenience, or reward is what we say, then I'll say yes. And you don't even need to take the data away from my phone. You can process it locally. Now, when every relationship is one-on-one, when businesses can get the data they need to do amazing new things, health and not just advertising, which we think about, why would they then go and buy the tracked rubbish? And if they're not buying the tracked rubbish, it's a very expensive thing to do to keep all this tracking system going and everything else. It will implode. Now, not tomorrow, not necessarily in 2 years' time, but 3, 4, 5 years' time. There'll still be some going on, but it will drop dramatically. All right, just like deaths in cars drop dramatically when we put seat belts and everything else in.
Is there something to be said for third-party data, though? I mean, the third party who tracks you online, who gathers information about you and supplies it to whatever business is looking to sell it. Because if you're supplying your own data, I mean, apart from standard fraud risk, right? Like, if you're over curating that data, is it necessarily painting the same picture, painting the authentic picture about you?
You're making the assumption I'm curating it. Now, it can be done in such a way that there is full traceability. So, for example, if I've got my bank data and Aneesh's company wants to do something with it, right, then you can actually show that it came from Bank A, was held by me unchanged, and then was passed unchanged. So you have chain of custody. So it's not necessarily curated, so that's not an issue. So I don't see that there's any place in the medium to term plus for tracking me. In reality, I do see that there's a place for people acting in marketplaces and data brokers and stuff from there, because how do I know what the best insurance is unless I'm prepared to say what I want and somebody's connected to the marketplace? If I want to share my health data for the public good, somebody needs to connect all the people like me that will share it philanthropically or will share it for money with the people who want to find it. So there'll be indexes and stuff like that. But these are all one-on-one relationships, you notice. So I know why I'm giving the data. I'm giving the data for this purpose and do. Now, will some companies try and fraudulently misrepresent themselves? Of course. There's trust. Trust is always abused in the system. But that can be handled much better than today. And I actually think you'll see the big internet companies will move over that way. Again, not overnight. It takes quite a while to change a supertanker, and we're talking about the world's biggest supertankers now, right, aren't we? So, but within the next 3 years, you'll find that the biggest companies in the world will actually be asking you for full consent. They'll have stopped tracking because there'll be other ways. So we are just on the cusp of a new consumer internet.
Charles, to that point, I mean, Julian is talking about one-to-one data transfers. So in, I think, one of the examples, it was basically pooling of health data so that at a broader public level, societal level, more insights could be generated. In your view, I mean, sounds like a great thing. I'm sure it is. Are there other consideration structures that need to be implemented, put in place? What's missing from the data management processing equation now that needs to exist for it to work?
In short, many things. So if you think about the sort of the private data for public good movement, of which there is a huge movement out there, a lot of large companies providing a lot of private data to solve humanitarian crises, to solve spread of diseases in certain scenarios. There are lots of challenges to doing that. So legal consent and consent of the data is obviously one of those things, and the amount of times that private data is not shared because of a potential legal issue is huge. There's no interoperability of this data, so there's a supply and demand mismatch of what they need and what they don't need. There's huge challenges of dirty data or provenance of data. So you only got data that you've already collected, but that doesn't give you anywhere near the picture sometimes that you might need to be able to try and actually solve the problem that you're trying to solve. If you're looking at developing countries and particular health issues, many of the people that might have those health issues don't have a smartphone which is pinging up where they are the whole time to their telco. So that telco can't share that data because it doesn't even exist. So there are huge challenges both on sort of the data side, the legal side, and also the sort of structural and sort of internal capacity side of private companies to do that. But fundamentally, there's a challenge of value for the business. So there's a huge demand from public authorities, from the UN, from other institutions for this. But private companies are saying, well, I've collected this, so why am I going to give it to you for free? It's costing me millions to collect this data, and what would be the potential benefit to that. So what we're trying to do, and we're working in partnership at the moment with NYU's GovLab, is like how to actually close that gap. So what is the actual value? How do you think about private company growth? So what are your actual objectives? Where do you want to be as a private company? And how can sharing data and responsibly sharing that data actually be a driver of that growth for you? It might be an old school sort of CSR/PR objective that you're trying to think about how you may position your business ethically or responsibly. But it might also be that actually having a very constructive relationship with your local financial authority or regulator actually is good for business. And therefore sharing data in aggregate form or insight form at some level actually will drive your business in the future.
So can I just sort of point out that?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's always difficult because it's such a wide subject. So I think you have to distinguish between individual data and aggregate data. So on an individual basis, clearly the one-to-one route works the best. On the aggregate data, it's who actually ends up being the aggregator. So as I said, I think there will be intermediaries that act as aggregators. They encourage 5 million people in the UK to donate their health data for good, but each time knowing it's Cancer Research UK and the particular charity we support, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy and others, right? So to do. When it comes to a nation, the technical problems you're talking about of interoperability and provenance can and are already solved, right? There's eminently solvable, bringing military techniques into those and stuff like that. So, but that's a detail. In terms of can you actually now get better data, right, is actually you can. We just have to think differently. What if there was a government app and we could all say we want to be part of it, and that government app we knew only took our data off anonymously because we trusted the government, and it always showed us what the data it was that it took it off? Would you have one? Well, good citizens might.
My God, that's like 1984 written all over it.
No, well, only
It's
if...
actually happening in some countries already.
Yeah,
but
but
only
not in
if
the
you're
UK.
worried about it. Is it 1984? If your data leaves you... Now, it's trust. So this is trust. Do you trust your government? Now, unfortunately, a lot of us don't trust.
Raise your hand if you trust your government.
Yeah,
Right.
we can't even get a national
hand.
ID card in this country. Like,
Correct. But in some places you can do it, right? And so...
Some
you
places you're forced to do it.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think it's
that's true. Now, I personally think you can trust the government in certain situations, right? If they said that they were taking data off anonymously, there's enough people in this world who'd be able to check an app for what it was doing, right? Now, that's the extreme, I grant you. But we must separate, what I'm really trying to get to is separate out individual data in groups where individuals are volunteering, and then mass government data, which can come from things like the National Health Service or other sets of data which are anonymised, and you have to trust the government there, right? So it's that you separate it out when we talk about it. Otherwise, it all ends up as a missed pool.
No, well, without getting like totally conspiracy theory on this, but I think you're absolutely right that even if it's not a centralized government app, if we're putting more structure and better processes around clean data, the kind of extraction, storage, processing of data, doesn't it open us up to, one, risk of simple traditional data breaches, but two, I don't know, Patriot Act 2 comes around, and suddenly the government is diving back into old data stores that weren't originally captured for those purposes. And I think a lot of Facebook users like kind of have that doubt in the back of their mind. Okay, I trust Facebook now, will I trust Facebook in 5 years? I trust this small company now. What if they get bought by Google? Does that change things?
Well, that's down to laws and stuff. But look, if and I worked in military systems, I built a military systems company. So if you want to know about what governments can do, right? But look, if a government turns bad, you're hosed, right? Let's just be clear about it. It would take months for a government that turned bad to put their fingers into systems that would make your life a misery. Right, we're there. You could create 1984 as a government within 2 to 3 months if you had full control of the powers. So you really, are you going to worry about that? Are we going to worry about that in the UK, whatever else? Now, depending upon your politics, you may agree with certain nations or not. But that's not a reason for not doing something, because otherwise you just got to go off grid, up in the mountain, and throw away all modern life. Because if government goes bad, you're hosed.
Well, now, how do we sort of translate to like the average consumer's thinking around this, right? So, we are biased here, right? This is a group that's probably extremely familiar with the word data and all its interpretations, and we can probably even say what GDPR stands for correctly. I've met people in the last few weeks who have A, no recollection of GDPR, and B, they call it GPPDR and all kinds of other acronyms. But so I always wonder, right, what is the average public, Joe public, and what is their interpretation of data, and how do they think about all the sequence of worries that we're sort of like building up? I don't know how you guys come across this. I mean, we see it from a business perspective, but what's the consumer perspective?
Hannah, what do you think?
I was at an event yesterday and someone was talking about their mother's interpretation of data, she's in her 80s, and her interpretation of data is her phone data from EE. She has no concept of data beyond that. So, I mean, that's a kind of an extreme example, but you're right. Julian's probably more likely to have real life examples of that.
Over the years, we've had over 500,000 people using our product to get back their data and do something with it. I can assure you, we don't use the word data. Right? We don't even mention it. We don't even mention most of these things, because you're absolutely right. The consumer only cares about the service that you're giving them. Right, and they'll do something for the service. Now, the question is, can you do it in such a way that instinctively they feel it's trustworthy, secure, and private, or an acceptable risk in what they're doing? So it's about the consent certificate you use. How have you stated what they're doing? It's about what the service is and they're doing. But yeah, we can't use GDPRs and data and technical terms like normalization of data and stuff like that. It's all about how do you make them feel, and it's a real fine art. I'll give you an example. We wanted people to use data, right, to have it for themselves and then to share it with consent. And our first product had the word safe in it. It's safe. Right? What did they think safe meant? They thought a safe meant something in the corner of the room, like a vault or locker that you put your data in and never see it ever again. Right? So tiny little nuances can destroy what you're trying to do, and the only way to make it work is just try again until you see the tick go in the right direction. But data, you can't use that word.
So I think this is Charles, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is our kind of understanding of or interpretation of GDPR, that it's been too thinly and narrowly interpreted. It's not just about compliance, and it's not just about ticking a box. It's you interpret it. You've got to have a change of mindset and how it sits within your whole organization. So, coming back to that, it's how you communicate with your consumers on a day-to-day basis. The GDPR session that you run is not just for your compliance and legal team. It's for your comms, it's for your marketing, it's for your whole team. And it's not just a one-off thing that you do and you forget about it. Every time you bring out a new piece of communication, you look at the language you're using. So, in your privacy policy, your terms and conditions, there are a copywriter that we use when we were putting together our website. We put together the initial wording, and he came back to us and said, that can't be understood. It's not easily understood by a 10-year-old or whatever. So you need to kind of put it in language and tone of voice that can be easily understood and interpreted by all ages. So it's the very, like you were saying, Julian, it's the very kind of everyday activities that your business goes through on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis. And it's a organizational change.
I agree 100%.
How far did the Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing set us back, or did it? because if you look back at the biggest headline-making data breaches, the Targets and Experians and Ashley Madisons and whatever else, headlines all over the place when it happens. A few weeks later, no one really seems to remember it. Does it really impact consumer behavior? In my sense, it probably doesn't, because at the end of the day, it's, what am I exchanging my data for? Well, it's a service that I'm really happy about getting. I think there's also something about, like, at the conceptual level, the global level, we're repulsed by what's happening. Who owns our data, how it's being misused, how it's being used to manipulate potentially our voting preferences. But at the individual level, we think, well, you know what? I don't really use Facebook all that much. Like, plus I know where I stand politically, so it doesn't really affect me. And there's not much tangibly that I can do. And it kind of stops there. I don't know. Charles, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. If you look at the day after or 2 days after, 50% off market cap. If you look now, it's back to where it was. And I think that one of the key problems actually with the whole system right now is the role of investors, seeing that they're actually still driving businesses that potentially are doing harm or using data in an irresponsible way. The biggest shift that made them lose 15% in that time was the threat of regulation. And in the US, that's not a legitimate actual threat at the moment. And with the particular administration there, that's also not going to be a threat for the next sort of 2.5, 3 years. But there is a significant sort of shift, I think, in the sort of the post Facebook Cambridge Analytica. And if you look at Yahoo, which is probably the biggest data breach, sort of 2 billion users, I think. They recently came out to correct that number because they misfactored it by factor of tenfold or whatever it was. Basically doesn't exist in many markets that it used to, and there are examples of those that we sort of have to hold dear to and say actually the market will provide in that sense, and where irresponsible behavior does happen, particular companies do suffer from it. But the role of investors is super important, that they're actually looking at this and developing and driving the growth opportunities for responsible companies.
Aneesh, so in your experience, you guys have investors. Is there pressure? Has there ever been pressure to use data that you're potentially already capturing, or to capture new sources of data in ways that are potentially commercially interesting, but don't necessarily stick true to your long-term mission?
I mean, this is a really good question, right? Because I think every company and perhaps every founding team, every management team needs to come up with their own philosophy, if you may, of what is their relationship going to be with that data. Are they custodians of that data? Are they owners of data? What realms do they allow that data to be used in? For example, we've been very public. We don't want to really use that data to market more products to you, right? We're not in the business of trying to get you into more debt. It's like we're probably the only credit bureau in the world that's saying that. But I think this will, it'll be interesting. You talked about Facebook. Let's talk about the big tech companies, right? So Apple's perhaps gone much more in a different stance and saying, hey, we believe we can be champions for data privacy. In fact, a couple days ago at the WWDC, it was really interesting when Safari says, okay, we're going to limit the number of variables we expose, so all Safari browsers start looking alike, right? So additional fonts and custom fonts are going away. Now, if Safari is doing that, I realize it's not the most popular browser, but Chrome will have to follow suit, because they're not going to be like, oh yeah, but we allow you, because again, consumer voices win. So that's going to be interesting. So that's companies, and big companies can make effect, but this is on layers that we're working through. So I always believe it has to come down to each company and each sort of regime who sort of thinks about it. So again, in our context, to answer your original question, I was fortunate that maybe I was a bit more mature while starting Aire, that I was able to put a couple hard lines in the sand as a company, right? Where we will use data, what type of data we will use, perhaps even what kind of lenders can use our data, right? So commercial interests, and yes, we're a VC-backed company, but that's important for us to have that dialogue up front. And we do say actively, even on the public website, that there will be commercial opportunities we will set aside if we don't believe that's the right ethical stance for us to take. And we are therefore starting to reach into that next space, which maybe tech companies haven't thought of that much, where, yeah, we're just a tech company. No, it's tech, what it comes with responsibility. And I know Spotify is getting a lot of heat in the last few months about choices they're making on their platform, but I think this is the space all of us have to start thinking about, right?
And do you find that resonates with your users?
From a user perspective, yeah, right? So if you think about us, I am still consumer number one for this company. I'm solving my own problem. So that helps, right? Because I apply every policy, every aspect of the company's choices we're making publicly to myself, and to some extent my team is user number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so that's that personal level engagement helps. But this is a good challenge, right? How will the sector evolve? And I'm talking about the sector in the wide context, all the ecosystem, all the data players, brokers, whether it's the tech companies, whether it's companies that are, the 2,000 companies you've never heard of that are making millions of dollars from weird types of data products, right? How will they all sort of think through that journey? Well, like I said at the start, unfortunately, not all of them are going to do the right thing. It's just the nature of the game. Some will. How long will it take? And to Julian's point, will it be this 2 to 3 year gap? Will it be this 10-year gap where market forces will start picking winners that they believe are doing the right things, right? So there is something interesting when you let, the market will always kick your teeth in if you're doing consistently wrong things. And I think Facebook sort of has some realization around that. They're trying to move fast, but there's still boundaries that they have to figure out where they want to be. And at least I give them credit for owning up and showing up to the Congress. I mean, those hearings were pretty tough for that company. But as Charles said, like the stock capitalization is probably back to where it was. It's probably even higher than it was probably.
Can I just sort of jump in there? I think you're right. It's the drip, drip, drip that eventually gets there, right? So one event isn't enough to change my behaviour. The second event may not be. Now, obviously, if I'm affected, and I wasn't affected by Ashley Madison, I don't use such, happily married, but if I'd been affected...
You have to say that, though.
Then I have to say that, but I really am. But the more important point is I'm saying is if I was affected, clearly I'm going to have a much higher propensity to worry about it going forwards. But the drip, drip, drip gets through to the public eventually. And I'm going to use the car analogy again, right? Cars got faster. They didn't have any safety. Nobody really worried about the fact that people were dying or severely injured, except those that went through windscreens. And then legislation came in and said, no, you really need a seatbelt. And because people were starting to worry. And then, hey, you wouldn't drive a car without a seatbelt. And actually, click every trip came in and we added it to the front seat passenger and then the back seat passengers. And now you just think, wow, I wouldn't have a car without a seatbelt, crumple zone. So it becomes the norm. And I think we're in that process. It's becoming the norm. But here's more important. When we added the safety devices to cars, we didn't slow them down. What we actually ended up doing was sped them up. We could do more with them. We could go off-road. We could do weird stuff with the cars that we could never do before, right? And that's what's happening now. That's why I think we should be positive, right? The addition of these safety measures means we can share more. We can do more. Right? And so therefore it's a very positive view of the future in that we will actually do more because we have the safety devices in place. And that's what's going to cause the companies to change. I'd love to think it was ethics that will cause the company to change. And for quite a lot of companies there will be. We're ethical. We don't even see, touch or hold user data, right? And there is a huge ethical movement to do better. But the big companies, you might question their ethics, whatever else. But I'll tell you one thing, they still want to make a profit. And if by fitting safety devices they can do more and make better profits, then sure as hell they're going to do that. And that's what we have to sell. You see, I think we spend almost too much time worrying about the privacy and not about, if we do it right, we can do more. So privacy is a given. So with what we're doing at DigiMe, privacy and security are just a given. Now you can do more. And that's what we've got to sell to businesses. Doing it right means more profit, not less. And GDPR enables you to do it right because you've got data portability and consent. You've got the tools there and you can see it and go, oh, okay, I get it. And that's the key. Ethics comes because it's going to be in the financial incentive of the businesses to be ethical, not the other way around, unfortunately.
So the only sort of while I totally agree with you, Julian, and I think you're absolutely right with the car example, the only thing, and all of us here have to wrestle with, is where does the regulatory line stop? Because going back to your original question, Will, what happens to that young engineer who wants to just build up a cool idea and now looks at this thing called GDPR and is like, oh my God, should I even start this company? Right? So going back to the car analogy, and I totally agree with that, Julian, we didn't get a lot of new car makers entering the space. We became more and more surrounded by the three large, at least from a U.S. perspective. So this is a question for all of us, right? It's a question for us in the tech sector, for the ecosystem, the regulators. How do you find that balance of adding regulation for the right reasons, right? You need car safety, you need car standards, but how do you also allow new entrants to come in and compete?
I'm going to be a one-track record, and I know it's terrible, and I'm sorry, I've been thinking about this for 9 years and doing it, right? So I've become a bit like that. But that's the point, right? Where the data is flowing all the way around us and behind us, it's impossible for startups to come in and compete. It really is, because they can't get your hands on the data. And if they do, like use Facebook data, they're constrained by the API rules and stuff, so that they can't use it, even if you're happy that they can. It's really difficult. Right now, it is a monopoly of data to big companies. But now when an individual owns it, right, and you can go to the individual and ask, any company can do it. You can create an app out of nothing and go directly to, you've got to market, you've got to find the individuals. That was a problem for every startup in the world ever, right? But you can now go and ask, and you can get much, much better data than any Google or Facebook has today. So just last week, I was in Iceland. We had a big hackathon there. Another 7 companies out of nothing were building apps using more data than Google or Facebook or anybody else has on the Icelandic population there, because we've been working there for a while. And that's what you do. You democratize data, right? Because the individual has it and the individual can decide to give it. You don't have to now try and make relationships with these massive companies. And it does solve the data democratization problem, right? When the individual has the data.
Yeah, I can agree to that, and I think that the people that have really followed the role of the internet to be a democratizer, to be an enabler, etc. I think 2012, 2014, some big things happened in the world. With Arab Spring and Snowden, etc. And there were some moments where we went from that utopian view to dystopian view, particularly in the West, around that. And I think that actually, if you lift up and look at the global picture, there are fewer companies in greater power than have ever been before, and the way in which they're able to use data to be able to sell products that another company would never be able to do because they were just a health company or a car company, etc. And I think that globally, because of the way in which data flows and how it is interacted, and the fact that companies can now decide to choose where they may or may not want to place themselves, the car analogy sort of falls on its head, because yesterday I was in Georgia and there's no such thing as an MOT, and you don't have to put the seatbelts on in the back seat, and there'll always be that
the country
market.
Georgia, right?
The country of Georgia, yeah. There is always going to be that place. There will always be those people that don't want to take it to the next level, and there are people that die, and that is a problem for particular markets. But there will always be this challenge of the lowest common denominator, which is what Aneesh was sort of talking about.
So the world is not perfect. We know that, right? And I think it's a uniquely tech perspective on the world that we think we can somehow make a perfect world. I'm just not there, right? Maybe I'm too old now to think that the perfect world, but we can make a better world, right? And even in the Georgias of this world, they're not fitting seatbelts because it's costing them money and they don't see the advantage, right? They don't value the life. But when companies can do more, right, by doing it right, they will. So we are working with companies in China as a good example. And he said, why? Chinese have lost all privacy to the government, right? But they actually want their privacy from companies. But companies are constrained. They can't get the health data. They can't do the new things that they want to do, that even the government wants them to do, because health's a big issue on GDP and growth and all the rest of it. But if the individuals have their data as they wander around China, right, they've got their data and more stuff can be done. So it's always about, to me, it's about what's the economic incentive for doing it right. Now, if the economic incentives aren't there, you get Georgia, right? But if the economic incentives are there, you can do it. And I think we look at GDPR and we look at these things and we're missing the key thing. So we were looking at reconsenting data. We weren't looking at data portability, right? One of the key planks of GDPR is data portability. You're right as an individual to have your data in electronic form available for reuse so you can decide. That is the key plank that opens up what I've been talking about. And yet I haven't seen it talked about in a single GDPR article in the last month. Right? Yet it's probably the most important thing in the whole of the GDPR.
Excellent. Guys, I think we could probably talk about this all evening. But we should probably wrap up very quickly. Maybe you can tell people where they can connect with you, find out more about your company. Aneesh, you want to go first?
Yeah, you'll find some horrible tweets from me on Aneesh Verna, which is just a straight my name as it's spelled. But for really interesting stuff, check out Aire. It's Aire.
Yeah, and you can find out more about us at weareadapt.io.
And you can find out more about us at digi.me, digi.me.
All right. Aneesh, Charles, Hannah, and Julian, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.